Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Drew McKevitt, the author of Gun Country, Gun Capitalism, Culture, and Control in Cold War America. This is his second book, and he is a professor of history at Louisiana Tech University. Thanks so much for being here, Dr. Drew.
Evan, thanks so much for having me.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. In 2021, 133 Americans a day were shot and killed, either by someone else pulling the trigger on purpose, pulling it by accident, or by oneself pulling the trigger on purpose or by accident. The bullets were fired from somewhere around 400 million guns. And that number, 400 million, Dr. Drew says, is not an accident or an unintended consequence of sloppy rulemaking. Rather, it is the result of a deliberate choice made by the people in charge and those who elect them. The argument from those opposed to gun control is that there is nothing at this point that any non-overzealous state can do regarding the proliferation of guns in our society. But Dr. Drew begs to differ. When and how did you realize that you begged to differ?
Wow, that's a good question. So this project goes back at least 10 years now. So I arrived in Louisiana. I'm a Northeasterner, originally grew up in New Jersey, did my PhD in Philadelphia, and arrived in Louisiana in 2012. And when I got here, I was working on a first book, which had nothing to do with guns. I'm not trained as a gun historian. And that first book was about U.S.-Japan relations. That's my background as a foreign relations historian. And so I was interested especially in kind of the local American encounter with Japan in the 1970s and the 1980s. So I wrote about things a little sort of outside the typical sphere of diplomacy. I wrote about Honda coming to Ohio in the 1980s. I wrote about VCRs and I wrote about anime and things like that. And so when I got here to Louisiana, I knew nothing about Louisiana's local connection to Japan. And so it started with something as simple as a Google search for like Louisiana and Japan. What can I learn being completely ignorant of my new home's connection to this topic I had at that point been working on for 6 or 7 years? And I came across the story of a 16-year-old Japanese exchange student named Yoshi Hattori.
And what a story in the book, by the way. I mean, his story, and I have questions about him, but this story happens again and again and again. But we'll get to it. But go ahead.
Yeah, so Yoshi's a 16-year-old Japanese exchange student. He's living in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, capital of Louisiana, and he's shot to death in 1992 when he knocks on the wrong door looking for a Halloween party. And, you know, as tragic as this was, as shocking as this was, it was, you know, thinking about the numbers you pointed out, one of 30,000 gun deaths in the United States that year. And so many Americans just sort of shrugged it off as this is another tragic consequence of our currently violent society. But for Japan, it was great shock. How could this thing happen? How could a civilized country allow someone to answer their door armed with a powerful handgun and shoot an unarmed teenager? And so it got me thinking about kind of the global connections and contexts of American gun violence, of American gun ownership. And that led me, you know, originally I thought I'd write maybe, I don't know, an article on Yoshi or something like that. And really it led me on sort of a chase or a hunt through archives all the way back to the Second World War.
Boy, a little bit of curiosity, and here you are, right? Decade later, with a book. You say the contemporary explanation that we've built collectively, not any one person, right, but just sort of what's been baked into our minds and into our society about why we have so many guns is shrouded in myth. That explanation is just bogus. So before you debunk the myth, what exactly is the prevailing storyline, the myth about why we have and love guns so much?
Well, the story is that we've always been the gun country, right? That we were founded on our relationship with guns, that the revolutionary generation secured our freedom with guns, that the citizens militia of the revolutionary era fought off the redcoats valiantly. It wasn't so much the professional soldier as it was the Minuteman who went and grabbed his gun when he heard the alarm that the redcoats were coming. And that established us as the gun country. And then, of course, there's all kinds of mythology about guns in the United States in the 19th century. And when I say mythology, and when I say myths, it doesn't mean these things aren't necessarily true. It just means these are stories we tell ourselves over and over again that explain who we are. And sometimes they are rooted in some kind of material reality. And of course, in the 19th century, we have the expansion and the Wild West, we have the frontier mythologies and so forth. And so this is often the story we've told, that Americans have always been a gun people. And there is some truth to that. There were more guns in the United States in the 19th century than there were in most other European societies at the time. There was a great deal of violence as a consequence of, or a great deal of gun control, we might call it, as a consequence of the system of slavery in the South. So, there was a reality there. But to me, the incredible number is the one we start with in 1945, and roughly how many guns are in the country then, right? It's about, best estimates are, and counting guns in the United States is it's an art in and of itself, because we by law can't count guns, right? The federal government, there's a federal law that says we can't register and count how many guns are in the United States. And so as best we could tell, there's about 45 million guns in the United States in 1945. Over the course of, the subsequent, how many years are we? 75, 80 years, the United States, U.S. population grows about 2.5 times, but the number of guns grows 10 times, right? So how do we explain that material change? Even if we are the gun country of the 18th and 19th century, something else happens in the post-war era. Some incredible exponential growth of guns happens. And I didn't have a good explanation for that. I should say historians didn't have a good explanation for that. And that's one thing I wanted to try to explain.
Before we get to the explanation, I just want to ask, where does, in your opinion, does the gun ownership rate in this country rank in what we need to understand in order to understand America?
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't know if, but let me just make it more clear. In other words, does the rate of those who have health insurance, is that as important? Does the number of public schools we have, how important is that? When you look at all the different factors in our society that makes our society, how important is the rate of gun ownership in understanding the country itself?
Yeah, well, it makes us exceptional, right? I mean, we like to talk about American exceptionalism in all different kinds of ways, and undoubtedly it is our gun ownership rate that makes us exceptional in the world. If we take, the best estimates of anywhere from 400 to 450 million guns in the United States today, that's about a gun and a third for every human being in the country. And that's, probably at least 2 guns for every adult in the country. And so that does make us exceptional in a global sense. And the closest countries that come anywhere near that we're at least double the rate of guns per person to the closest country. And, the thing about gun ownership in the United States is that it's not evenly distributed, right? So there's 450 million guns, but that doesn't mean every adult owns 2 guns. Right. Those guns are concentrated in certain hands, right? And so we know gun owners are more likely to be men. They're more likely to be older. They're more likely to be white. I don't know what the latest estimate was, but as of several years ago, the number of guns per gun owner was something in the range of 7 or so guns per gun owner. The average number, I don't know if that's a median or a mean number of guns per gun owner. So guns are not evenly distributed among the population. They're in the hands of people who historically have held power in the United States. Now, is that changing? Kind of, sort of. We saw trends, especially in the wake of the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement, that saw growing rates of gun ownership among African Americans, among people of color generally, among women. But I don't know if that's a long-term trend or simply sort of a fad that peaked because of the exceptional gun buying of 2020 and 2021.
So how does this post-1945 consumer capitalism, Cold War era start to develop, and how does the energy start to be steered towards guns are a consumer product as opposed to a tool that the nation needs in order to defend itself?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think arguably guns are a consumer product from the middle of the 19th century on. So we have, figures like Samuel Colt, Oliver Winchester. These are the great gun capitalists of the 19th century, and they invent the consumer market. And I use that verb invent intentionally because that's their goal, is to create a mythos around guns. They tell stories about guns. They make guns appealing to the consumer. But what happens in the post-war era is the explosion of a mass consumer market. We have, for the first time, guns available to tens of millions of Americans, largely because guns become increasingly cheap. That cheapness, I argue, is essential to understanding the post-war gun market. Gun prices are driven down. The availability of cheap guns goes up. And this is largely a product of the United States engagement with the post-World War II world. So in 1945, lying on battlefields and in warehouses all across Europe and in Asia, there are tens of millions of guns that were used in the war that are now basically obsolete. In Europe, you can't distribute those guns among most populations in Europe. And this continent that's just experienced now like some 30 years of on and off horrific war certainly doesn't want to distribute tens of millions of guns to its population. You also have war stockpiles and defense stockpiles are being renewed with new technology, new kinds of firearms. And so you have obsolete firearms sitting in these warehouses. What do you do with all those guns? There's a few American entrepreneurs who spot this possibility here. All these millions of guns sitting there and no consumer market for them. And so they jump on the opportunity. In many cases, they buy guns, rifles that were used in the war for as cheap as $1 each or even less. The most important figure in this regard, I think, is a man named Samuel Cummings, who plays an important part in the first couple chapters of my book. Samuel Cummings is the founder of a company called Interarms. By the end of the 1950s, Interarms is the world's largest private arms dealer. And Samuel Cummings, he gets this sort of reputation as kind of a Cold War man of mystery, jet setter, that sort of thing. There's always rumors about him first working with the CIA and then supplying big weapon systems and fighter jets to dictators all over the world. But the way he makes his money is in the most kind of mundane and quotidian way. And that's just selling cheap guns to Americans, because he's cleaning out those warehouses in Europe, and he's bringing them, he's cleaning up the guns. He uses this term sporterize to describe what he's doing to the guns. He's got a whole team of gunsmiths working to clean these things up rapidly, get them in shape to sell on the American market for the American hunter. And he sends them to the United States, and he's selling them for as cheap as $10 a piece. And this is at a time when the high-end good hunting rifle from a company like Remington might cost you $120, $150, depending what kind of accessories you're looking at. So a gun that's just a tiny fraction of that price, those guns start flooding the market, and it causes a mini panic in the industry. And that's where we see the first efforts to sort of control this kind of thing. And then as legislators in the 1960s become increasingly concerned with urban violence, with urban uprisings in places like Watts and Newark and Detroit, they'll increasingly focus on this flow of cheap war surplus imports into the United States. And I think that's where this market is created. It's a transition in the market from the gun as sort of a tool of hunting and tradition and connecting to the American past to something that's as cheap and affordable as any consumer product you might see if you walk into Sears. And you could get one in Sears too. They were selling Samuel Cummings guns as well.
My next main question is, at what point and how does the idea take hold that the founders want you to have guns? And the way I want to ask that is to just give us a quick little primer here. I know your book's not focused on the Second Amendment or interpreting it, but give us a primer on how close we can get to understanding what the framers intended when it comes to a practical reading of the amendment. And it reads on paper, and I'll read it here: a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. How close can we get to understanding what they meant from either reading those words or from analyzing the debate that was had over the amendment itself?
Yeah, Evan, you're opening a real can of worms here. This is messy stuff.
Just pretend I took one worm out. What is that worm telling you?
So if we're asking that question of a historian, someone who's trained to study the 18th century, to study social and political and economic life in the 18th century, what they would say about the amendment, and I think the best historian of this is a guy named Saul Cornell. He teaches at Fordham University. He wrote a great book called A Well-Regulated Militia. It's maybe about 15 or 20 years old now. And what that book says is that the founders were, as a generation, divided about everything, right? It's, if anyone says to you, the founders believed, you check your wallet, because there's no way that person is going to say something accurate, because the founders disagreed about everything. And they disagreed about firearms as well, or at least the place of firearms within the new constitutional regime, because by and large, they didn't actually spend a lot of time debating this thing. For the most part, there was general agreement that the Second Amendment, at least, was a statement about the relationship between the state and the federal government. The militias were tools of the state, or they could also be tools of the federal government. So among the various perspectives, you have people like Thomas Jefferson, who believes that what the Second Amendment says is that a state has the right to raise its own militia and use that militia to defend itself, even against the federal government, if necessary. On the other hand, you had Federalists like Washington and Hamilton, who believed that the amendment was a statement of a statement for the federal government to use the militia in defense of the state being the new country that's been created. But there's a sort of radical strain out there as well. And you see it among the Whiskey Rebellion, you see it among the Shays Rebellion types, who believe that the militia can be as small and as local as a group of farmers in Western Massachusetts who are angry about taxes. And they have the right to raise arms against their government if they feel sort of the government is behaving tyrannically. But by and large, the vast majority of people we'd identify as founders did not agree with that. And so in all of those cases, we're talking about people who are arguing about the role of the militia. They're not talking about the question of individual gun ownership. That didn't mean that generally they didn't accept the right of the individual to own guns, because they did, but they didn't see the Second Amendment as a statement in that regard. Now, the reason you open a can of worms is that if you ask a whole sort of school of legal scholarship, they would tell you everything I just said is bunk.
All right, I'll ask them on the next episode. Really curious about the book, how you crafted it. Before we get back to sort of the narrative here, what were your sources for this book? What kinds of archives did you have to plumb in order to put this together?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because there's no one sort of central repository of archives on gun capitalism, right? By and large, like any of the companies who were active in this era, you're not going to get access to their archives, at least not their collections that cover the post-war era. Even, like a company like InterArms, the biggest private arms seller in the world, probably in the 1950s and the 1960s. I have no idea where their archives are, because Samuel Cummings died in 1997. The company collapsed. It's the same year his daughter shoots and kills her fiance and goes to jail for years. So it's probably sitting somewhere in a farm, or maybe it was burned down, and who knows. So, depended on kind of the question I ask, and each chapter, I think, asks a different question. For material, really for material in the first 2 or 3 chapters, there's a lot of material I took from the work of a commission appointed by Lyndon Johnson in 1968. Comes to be called the Eisenhower Commission. It has a much longer National Presidential Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence, something to that effect. And it's kind of a stepchild of the Kerner Commission. A lot of people know the Kerner Commission, which investigates the urban uprisings. And the Eisenhower Commission follows up to look at violence more generally in American life. And they have a whole task force that is tasked with writing about guns across American history. And so they gather lots of material. And all this material is sitting in the Johnson Library in Austin. And I don't know, I haven't identified another book that's used this material. I kind of got a sense nobody's used it, because when the archivist brought it out, he sort of explained, nobody's processed this stuff, and it's not organized. So just, put it back in the order in which you found it. So that helped to make sense of the 1950s and the 1960s. And then in the book, I turn in the 1970s and write a lot about gun control organizations, the earliest ones in the United States. I wrote about a couple of them in Chicago. And that's where the archival base gets a little better, because they left their material. So there's one that's founded by a woman named Laura Fermi. Laura Fermi is the widow of Enrico Fermi of the Manhattan Project fame. And they're working in South Side of Chicago, Hyde Park, really, and they leave their records there at the University of Chicago. There's another group working on the North Shore, group of women who self-identify as housewives, and they use this identity quite smartly, and they leave their records at the University of Illinois at Chicago. So some gun control archival sources are available. But the thing that really got me onto this project is, back to the Yoshi story. Yoshi's host family, they're the Haymakers. They were professors at LSU in Baton Rouge. In the wake of Yoshi's death, they began a gun control campaign, and they kept all their stuff, and eventually they gave it to LSU. And so that was the first time I found I went into an archive starting to ask these questions about gun ownership and gun violence, and that pointed me in a lot of really interesting directions.
Cool. You've certainly proven why you cared and why you felt that this fills a need in a scholarly sense. But I'm really curious, how has gun violence impacted you personally? In other words, why do you care so much about this to spend a good portion of your life writing about it?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't have close family members who've been affected by gun violence. And that's in part because I myself grew up in white middle-class New Jersey, and gun violence disproportionately impacts certain communities in the United States. But I did have a kind of personal connection to gun consumerism, which kind of led me in this direction of gun consumerism, which was my grandfather. I don't know if you noticed, but I dedicated.
I had a question about the dedication, but go ahead.
That's Please. Right. No, the dedication reads something to the effect of, to my grandfather, who would have hated every word of this book.
Great dedication.
Which is really true. As I spent so much time combing through like gun control archives and politicians' records, especially politicians who were interested in controlling guns. I was like certain that one day I was going to come across some angry letter he wrote, because he was definitely the guy to write an angry letter to a gun control organization or to his politician to complain about someone violating his Second Amendment rights. And he owned a lot of guns, just a ton of guns. And this is kind of part of my upbringing. Like there's a photograph of me when I can't even be a year old. I couldn't have even been walking yet, and I'm spread out on his bed. I'm assuming it's his bed, and beneath me, I'm laying atop a Confederate flag, and on my lap is I'm pretty sure it's a Smith & Wesson 44 Magnum, which probably weighed more than I did at that moment. And so that, in the same way that sort of my upbringing in like New Jersey, consumerism got me interested in writing about Japan. It was that kind of drew me to want to write more about gun consumers and to think about gun buyers as consumers, right? When we use that word consumer and consumerism, so often historically it's coded in sort of gendered terms. It's like consuming is a thing that women did, right? When we're writing about supermarkets and shopping, that's women's experience historically, and men are producers. So to me, it was just really interesting to think about gun buyers as consumers, and a movement like a gun rights movement as primarily a consumer movement, wanting to protect consumer rights and access to a market.
All right, you've mentioned Yoshi now several times. My question's about Yoshi and the fellow who shot him, Rodney Pears. I'm not sure how to say his name. Pears.
I think it's Pears.
Yeah. My question about them was, what does Yoshi represent about being the victim of a shooting in America, and what does Rodney represent about being a gun owner in America? Can we glean larger stories from Yoshi and his being shot and Rodney and his doing the shooting?
Yeah, I mean, Yoshi's just such a, you don't want to sort of romanticize or sentimentalize your historical subjects, but he's just such an ideally sort of innocent figure in this story. He's only in the United States for 3 months. He loves American culture. He's so excited to write to his friends back home about all the sights he sees in the United States. It's just funny how he's just excited to write about like driving over the Mississippi River in Baton Rouge, which is just a hideous landscape. There's nothing pretty about it at all, but it's just so precious to sort of read him writing to his friends and telling them about that. And then this horrific thing happens to him, in part because he doesn't understand gun culture, right? He doesn't understand, and this is as best we know, right? Because he's killed and we don't know what he was thinking in that moment. So what happens is he and his host brother, his name's Webb Haymaker, who's also 15 or 16 or 17 at the time, they knock on the door, and Rodney Pears' wife answers, and she screams and slams the door, and she tells Rodney to go get the gun because she sees Yoshi and Webb dressed in Halloween costumes. And Rodney goes and he grabs the gun and he opens the carport door, and he sort of peeks out and he sees Yoshi and Webb there. And Yoshi starts moving quickly toward him because they think like, okay, maybe they were looking for a Halloween party. He thinks maybe we did find the party and they were playing a prank on us. Who knows what he was thinking, but he's walking quickly towards the door. And everyone who knows him talks about how he moves in this sort of kinetic way. He's a great dancer. He loves to dance. He gets in trouble for dancing a little too suggestively at school in Baton Rouge, and he's moving real fast. And he says, "We're here for the party. We're here for the party." And Rodney yells, "Freeze!" And as best we could tell, Yoshi doesn't know what freeze means. It's a colloquial expression, right? It's like stick 'em up or something like that. It's not clear what that means. And so Yoshi keeps moving. Rodney pulls the trigger. And he kills Yoshi. And so Yoshi is such a good lens on American gun culture from the outside. And the whole reaction in Japan is such an incredible perspective on the United States from the outside, because to us, Americans become in some ways immune to tens of thousands of gun deaths every year. Japan has less than 100 in a given year. There's one year where they had less than 10 gun deaths in the United States, which is not to say that there's no violence in Japan, but at least people don't die from gun
There are
violence.
probably 10 in Florida, the state that I'm in right now today.
Right. That's right. As you said, hundreds every day, right? And we're talking about 30,000 or, even, gosh, I think we're approaching
48,000 was
40
the
or
most
40
recent.
or 50, 45. Yeah. Just incredible numbers in a global context, right? So Japan's a country about a third of the size of the United States in terms of population, and just a tiny, tiny fraction of gun violence, in part because gun ownership is unheard of in Japan. It's not that people don't own guns, but if they do, they're for hunting and they're kept at the local police station, and you have to register them and go through an onerous taxation process, and people just otherwise don't do it. There's fewer than 1 million guns in a country of 120 million people.
This story reminds me so much. The story of Yoshi reminds me so much of Amadou Diallo. I'm not sure if you know his name, but he was an immigrant from Guyana, I think, who was killed in New York City by a policeman. And it kind of came out that the main problem was he didn't understand what the police were telling him. And I have to say, the trial, even though it wasn't a police officer on trial in the case of Yoshi, it also reminded me, A, of the Diallo trial, but B, it had echoes of so many other gun deaths and that end up going to trial in the United States. So I'm just curious, what sort of we can glean from the way this trial goes down as it represents the conflicts we see all the time in courtroom about who is responsible for a death. And oftentimes court decides nobody is responsible for it.
Right. Yeah. What it reminded me of when I first learned about it was Trayvon Martin, because it was, I think it was 2012. And I first came across the Yoshi case. It probably would have been early 2013. So that's what I thought of. And, so Piers is let go. Because the police believe he acts in self-defense. There is in Louisiana, as there is in many states, there was at the time something called the Castle Doctrine law, which says that you have the right to defend your home, your quote unquote castle, with deadly force if you feel threatened there. You don't have the traditional common law notion was the retreat to the wall. You don't have the obligation to retreat to the wall in your own home, which is to say you don't have the obligation to flee until you can't flee anymore. You can use deadly force on your property. And so initially he is let go. Within days, though, he's arrested and charged, in part because I think of the international kind of outrage over Yoshi's killing.
And that happens all the time. I mean, we saw it just happen in, I think it was Georgia, right? When
was that the two guys with the jogger?
Yeah,
right?
Who chased the jogger, right? Whose name, of course,
Aubrey.
Yeah, Ahmaud Arbery. I mean,
right.
That it sounds very familiar to that. They were let go until there was an outcry.
That's right. And so eventually he's charged and he goes on trial and he is acquitted of manslaughter charges. And it's a jury of peers from East Baton Rouge Parish who acquit him of this. In the aftermath, the local press is trying to understand, why would a jury do this? Half of the jury identified as gun owners. There was a questionnaire that the jurors got before, potential jurors got, and through a Freedom of Information Act request, the local newspaper got the responses to those questionnaires. And many of the people described that they were fearful of crime themselves. And this characterizes Rodney Piers and his wife, Bonnie. Rodney had talked about he threatened, he said he had told a neighbor that if Bonnie's ex-husband ever comes lurking around on their property, he would shoot him. They said that they had tools stolen from their carport recently. Bonnie people described Bonnie as sort of skittish, that she was scared of her own shadow when she went out at night, that she wouldn't even roll the garbage cans out to the curb at night or go shopping at night because she was afraid she'd be kidnapped or something. And this is I think this is a kind of common white anxiety from this era in the early 1990s of urban crime. This is on the outskirts of Baton Rouge, so it's a white neighborhood, but Baton Rouge is a majority Black city. Baton Rouge suffers from the same kinds of deindustrialization and the war on crime that other major cities around the country are suffering from. And so Piers's fears reflect that kind of sentiment. And the way, by 1992, it just makes perfect sense that you have several guns in your house to protect yourself in those circumstances.
I want to hear more about how this culture develops to the point where guns and A, political identity, and B, cultural identity become one and the same. And I want to introduce that topic by asking about, I'm not sure if you know about this, you probably don't, a group of kids in Lakeland, Florida. And when I say kids, one of them was underage, 6 or 7 of them were in their very early 20s and late teens. But a group of young men and one juvenile in Lakeland, Florida, were just caught breaking into cars to steal guns. And the cars that they chose to break into had bumper stickers on them that hinted at conservatism.
I know what's coming.
Okay, they hinted at conservatism and gun ownership. We've seen the bumper stickers. Whatever they say. I'm a gun owner. Second Amendment. My rights. Don't end where your feelings begin. Things like that. So they were able to target cars based on the bumper stickers. How did we get to a point where gun ownership was a cultural and consumer identity that people have?
Yeah, gosh, that's fascinating. That's a fascinating story because there was a study years ago that had spoken to people who were in prison who had charges of gun theft on top of whatever else. And, they had concluded that if you advertise yourself as a gun owner, if you have an NRA sticker on your truck, you are advertising to people that there are guns in your house and, likely they're not locked up and they're going to be easy to steal. So that's sort of fascinating that they went even further and identified not just the statement, I'm a gun owner, but more political affiliation more generally of conservatism. Which of course lines up with gun ownership rates. So, I think the traditional narrative here goes back to the 1970s and the NRA's kind of turn to a harder line in the 1970s. Typically, the story goes to 1977 in what's sometimes called the coup in Cincinnati. So it's the National Rifle Association's annual meeting takes place in Cincinnati. The organization has been, over the previous several years, up to 1977, seemingly moving away from intense political battles. And there are people in the organization who don't want it to do that, who instead want it to take a kind of hard line approach to the defense of unlimited gun rights. And so there's through machinations on the floor at the annual convention, a new cohort comes to power led by a man named Harlan Carter. Harlan Carter had made a career as a border patrol agent. It came out later after he became head of the NRA that he had shot and killed a Mexican teenager when he was a boy himself, or 16, 17-year-old himself. He was convicted of that crime. It was later overturned. And he takes he leads the NRA in this hardline turn. What I do in the book is I kind of trace that hardliner turn back to the 1960s. And I think starting in 1977 doesn't take us far enough back because there's a backlash in the 1960s to the Gun Control Act. I think the Gun Control Act is the central kind of element in the story of post-war gun consumerism, gun violence, gun rights, gun culture in the United States. And so through the 1960s, there were all kinds of new proposals coming before Congress that to restrict guns. They really accelerate after Kennedy's killing in November of 1963. It's led mainly by a senator from Connecticut. His name was Thomas Dodd. And he chaired the Juvenile Delinquency Subcommittee. And Dodd has hundreds of witnesses come before his committee and has dozens of hearings over the course of 4 or 5 years. And eventually, the Gun Control Act of 1968 passes. The thing that gets it over the line is the killing of King. It's the killing of Bobby Kennedy in June 1968. And as that movement is building up in Congress, there is a grassroots movement of gun owners who are connecting to other right-wing causes in the United States and right-wing organizations in the United States. Think of people who might join the John Birch Society, for instance. And they are rallying in 1968. And they see 1968 as a real turning point, or it's the beginning of the metaphor they use is that it's a slippery slope. And this is only going to help our enemies. This is aiding and abetting the communist takeover of the country. This is doing the work for the communists by disarming Americans. Of course, nobody's really disarming Americans in 1968, and very few gun control advocates in Congress, at least, are advocating disarming Americans. But this is used as a kind of rallying point for these right-wing gun activists, who will then push that message upward into the National Rifle Association, into new lobbying organizations that we get in the 1970s, like the Second Amendment Foundation, the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms, is this alphabet soup of acronyms that emerge in the 1970s. And that's really the key moment where we start to see gun ownership and gun rights advocate mixing with a more explicit political identity of conservatism.
And now this is maybe my favorite stat in politics. In 2016, if only gun owners voted, Donald Trump would have won 50 states. If only non-gun owners voted, Hillary Clinton would have won 49.
Wow, that's incredible.
What does that say?
I mean, I would have guessed Hillary would have won like Vermont or Massachusetts, maybe, but I guess not. I don't.
Yeah. What does that tell you about how far gone we are? I mean, you said the only fact that gun owners and non-gun owners agree on is that we are the gun country.
That's right. And, that is a polarization that's happened in the last 30, 40 years. Because I think if you asked the same question in I'd be fascinated to see what like the 1968 election would look like in that regard. Or even, before the 1960s, in this era of contentious debate over what becomes the Gun Control Act of 1968, what would 1960 have looked like? And I think it would have looked much more bipartisan. And so, it points to that rapid polarization that has happened over issues, not just like guns, but issues like abortion and gay rights and so forth.
Yeah, I bet you could have a similar result if you took pro-choice people and pro-life people.
Right, which is to say that the gun rights movement is embedded in this larger kind of right-wing culture war since the 1970s.
All right, what's the future of gun ownership in America? Is it going to just be ever upward for as long and as high as the eye can see? In 5 years, if we did this interview, would gun rates be triple what they are now, like exponential? Or what do you think we're going to look at here over the next few decades?
Yeah, oh man, you never ask a historian to pick the future, but yeah, that's right. 2020 and 2021 were the two largest years of gun sales in U.S. history. And things started to go down in 2022. I don't know what 2023 looks like, but still the number of guns sold is far higher than what was being sold 10 or 12 or 15 years ago. And we know that gun buying increases and spikes at moments of political and social instability. So before 2020 and 2021, the biggest spike came in 1968, right? And that's in the aftermath of the urban uprisings in Newark and Detroit in 1967, when we see handgun ownership rates skyrocket. 1968, in the aftermath of King's killing, we have uprisings in 100 or more cities, and that provokes gun buying. And that's not just me saying like, well, people are scared, they're buying guns. Like the NRA knew that in the 1970s. There's this great moment where Harlan Carter himself, the man who takes over the NRA, is talking to a gun control convention in Los Angeles in I think it's 1975. And he says, you're all being fools if you think people aren't buying guns because of fear. We know that better than anyone. Go to your local gun dealer and ask him why people are buying guns. They're buying guns because they're afraid. When there's news when the nightly news tells some story of some grisly murder, the next day, gun purchasing spikes. We know why people are buying guns. So we know why people were buying guns in 2020 and 2021. And we know, I expect 2024 is going to be another peak year, either because fears created as a consequence of whatever sort of social chaos another Donald Trump run for the presidency is going to create, or because there might be fears that a second Biden administration will crack down more so on gun purchasing. I don't think that'll really happen. But when Democratic presidents are elected, gun purchases spike in that particular moment.
There are a lot of people who say that Al Gore lost the 2000 election because of his stance on guns in states like West Virginia and even potentially in Florida.
That's right. And the NRA took credit for it too. I mean, Wade LaPierre was out there on the campaign trail.
But I guess the question is, will a Democratic president ever have, enough support in Congress for people to say, I'm going to risk my seat to make a major change?
Right. And then the question is, what's the major change, right? So we got a law in 2022 in the aftermath of the horror in Uvalde. And it's more of the same. I think it's a step in the right direction. I think red flag laws are important and valuable and can be useful. More stringent background checks or universal background checks, terrific. But they are not going to do anything about 450 million guns, right? And so what do you do about that stockpile? I'm asking you because I honestly don't know, right? And so it's a question of not so much of like, what can we do about guns in the future, but what do we do about a society that is already more armed than any in human history, right? And so how do we build safeguards to ensure that those guns don't threaten human security in our own country? And I just don't know if I have a good answer to that. And I worry that the instability of our politics looking forward is just going to generate more anxiety. And, nobody loves that more than the gun sellers.
I have heard your questions, and I'm going to pretend I didn't and go to the next question because I don't know either. All right, I want to be judicious with your time here. Game 7 of the NLCS is going on right now. You are a Phillies fan. It is 1-1 in the third inning. One more question, maybe two. If you could put this book in the hands of every politician in America, let's say in Congress, and not only would you put it in their hands, but they would have to read it, what should they take from this book to inform themselves about the future of policy?
Gosh, what a question. That's such a fantastic question. Now I'm going to turn it around and be the historian here and say that we've already had this moment. Back in 1966, the first sort of popular book to advocate for gun control was written by a journalist named Carl Bacall. Carl Bacall was from Wyoming. He wrote on a whole bunch of topics as a journalist, but he turned his attention to gun violence and gun ownership in the early 1960s. And he publishes this book called To Keep and Bear Arms in 1966. And that book does end up on, I know for a fact that it's sitting on the bookshelves and on the bedside tables of various members of Congress in leading up to the passage of the 1968 Gun Control Act. And why I think that book was so important is because it was the first real work of research to put American gun violence in a global context. Carl Bacall said, "This is weird. When we look at how the rest of the world deals with guns and the kinds of violence that other places have, this only exists here, or it exists in countries that are currently at war. So are we at war?" And so it was a really important work of journalism that spurred a lot of activism, not just to pass the Gun Control Act of 1968, but you saw gun control activists in these early organizations in the 1970s citing it all the time. So that was a really important book that did end up on the desks of a lot of members of Congress, and it did some really important work. And that's been me spending 90 seconds trying to deflect this question because I don't know exactly. Because the truth is, when you say capitalism to a member of Congress, they're dismissive of it, right? They think you're pushing some sort of radical agenda to overthrow the American capitalist system or something like that. When in reality, I just want us to think about guns as a material problem, right? All right. Like, think about guns like we think about refrigerators or skateboards or something.
Imagine if refrigerators were killing people every day. That's right. People using refrigerators even. All right, it's 1-1 in the third. Alec Boehm hit a home run for the Phillies run, and Christian Walker hit into a fielder's choice for the Diamondbacks run. I really just want to ask, though, and I'm being selfish here with your time. How do you talk with your students about this? This is an emotional issue for adults. How do you guide your students many of whom I assume are from the South, who might share different political views from you, although I don't know. How do you teach this subject without getting 100 letters sent to the university that you've got to, for the lack of a better term, shut your mouth?
Well, that happens anyway.
Okay,
but at least
there you go. All right.
So far, I've been able to fend it off. But it's never the students doing that. I think the students always, they see that I'm interested not in our contemporary political debates. Like you and we can talk about politics here, and I could tell you sort of how I feel about certain issues, but I don't do that in the classroom. The classroom is thinking about history as a disciplinary approach to problem solving, right? So we have a contemporary problem. How do we use history to think about that problem? And I can tell you, when you dive into the Virginia ratification debates in 1789, 1790, whenever it was, and you start reading those, you very quickly sort of take your mind out of the present and you put yourself back in the 18th century. And that's a way of turning down the heat on the conversation, of saying, like, I don't really care what you think today. I want to know your reading of what Patrick Henry is saying 230 some odd years ago about the role of the militia in society. And I think taking that approach very quickly, maybe to use a bad metaphor here, but very quickly disarms students who may even come into the classroom ready to have those fights. One of my favorite students I've had to this point, this was the first time I taught the gun history class. This is going back 5 or 6 years now. And it's the first day of class, and it's that moment where you go around the room and you introduce yourselves and say something about yourselves and so forth. And so he's the first student I call on. He's sitting in the front. He's wearing his NRA shirt, or maybe it was an NRA hat. There was an NRA, maybe it was an NRA sticker.
Yeah.
There may have been a Make America Great hat involved here. There was some camouflage somewhere on here. And, he's a buddy of mine now. He doesn't mind me telling this story. And he says, my name's Owen, and I like guns, and my family likes guns, and my family's, we're families in law enforcement. We like to shoot guns. We like to hunt, et cetera, et cetera. And last year I shot myself. And it's like, that'll wake you up. On
that should have been the opening of your book or something like that, right? And last year I shot myself.
That's right. And
although the opening of your book is fabulous, by the way, but go ahead. Sorry. Yes.
Thank you.
Just want to clean that up. But go ahead.
What happened was he accidentally shot himself in the stomach while he was cleaning his handgun. And he had a near-death experience. He had to be rushed to the hospital. And so forth. And it's almost like a sort of fairy tale. Like, I think he was some sort of engineering major at that moment. He became a history major, and he graduated with his history degree because of that class. And then he went on to get a master's degree in history. And I think he just recently graduated with his master's degree. But that was such a learning experience, because it's like, clearly he and I were not going to connect politically, but we connected on the history stuff. And, taking your mind out of the present and trying to put it back in the 18th century is a really valuable exercise for students who get fired up about these issues. And instead, it's like, I want to know why Patrick Henry was fired up. I want to know why James Madison was scared of him. And so, yeah, I think that the history can be disarming, and that's what I've always found when I've taught these gun history classes.
All right, just real quick, what's next for you scholarly wise? You're working on a book, it looks like, from your website, U.S. Workers in Foreign-Owned Factories in the United States. What's that all about?
That's sort of a branch off project from my first book. I wrote a lot about workers at Honda in Ohio in the 1980s, and I've always been sort of fascinated by that transition of labor in the United States. And that's been a project I've been working on with a colleague at Louisiana Tech, David Anderson, who is a trained labor historian. So he's taught me a lot about labor history, because I myself do not have that background. The other thing I'm really interested in is writing about 1967 and 1968 and looking at it from the perspective of white communities organizing for vigilante and paramilitary violence in the context of Black uprisings. I think we've had a lot of great work recently on those uprisings in places like Newark and Detroit and so forth. I want to know the stories of how white communities were preparing almost in a military way to go to war. And I don't think we have enough of those stories. And I've I found traces here and there, and that's what I want to do next, is I want to pursue those stories.
Fascinating. It's still 1-1 headed into the bottom of the third. Dr. Drew McKevitt, the author of Gun Country, Gun Capitalism, Culture and Control in Cold War America. Thank you so much for joining us.
Evan, thanks so much for having me. Thank you for your careful reading of the book. I really appreciate this. Thanks.
And here's to Grandpa Carl, by the way. Check out the book. Check out his website, andrewmckevitt.com. He's on the website formerly known as Twitter. He is a force there at Drew McKevitt. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.